Greetings, newbie. Today you will learn about the infamous SQL injection vulnerability that has wreaked havoc and disrupted major industries. Many of the most serious data breaches were in fact a result of successful SQL injection attacks. This vulnerability has been around for decades and will surely be around for many years to come. You better learn about it, or live in ignorance for the rest of your life. Let's start with some historical facts. Let's take a walk down memory lane. If you're old enough, you have probably heard this intrusive noise before. Can you guess which decade we're in? We're now in the 1990s, a decade that was riddled with wars, natural disasters, slow internet, and even worse, boy bands. To add insult to injury, society broadly viewed hackers as nothing more than simple pranksters. Indeed, those were some dark days. But there was hope. The computer advancement made in the 1990s was some of the most exciting in the history of computers. The PC industry was booming as computers became faster, easier to use, and more accessible. Another important milestone is that the World Wide Web was made publicly available to everyone thanks to Tim Berners-Lee.
We installed the internet on our computer just a short time ago, and I haven't been able to get the kids off it ever since.
With the internet available in more homes and offices across the globe, and as more and more data was stored digitally, the attack surfaces increased rapidly. It was a dream come true for hackers. Many new vulnerabilities were identified and exploited during that time. One of them is the infamous SQL injection vulnerability that was documented in the late 90s by a hacker named Jeff Forrestal. Hackers exploited this vulnerability to, among other things, bypass authentication mechanisms and to steal and tamper with data. There are several documented SQL injection attacks with devastating consequences. One of them is the attack on 7-Eleven in 2007, which resulted in hackers stealing millions of credit card numbers. Another one is the attack on Sony in 2011, which resulted in millions of consumer information such as passwords, home addresses, to be leaked online. You might be surprised to hear that this vulnerability remains a large security concern to this day. Indeed, SQL injection has survived the test of time.
Alright guys, let's get started. As you probably already know, all web applications employ some form of database to store information. In this video, we're going to focus on relational databases, which uses a structured query language, or in short SQL, to access, view, and modify data. So how can the attacker exploit relational databases? Well, one way of doing that is by exploiting SQL injection vulnerabilities, which enables the attacker to manipulate queries that the application makes to its database. In other words, this vulnerability allows the attacker to inject malicious SQL queries through the user-provided data via, for instance, input fields in an application. The impact of SQL injection attacks can be very serious. It can enable the attacker to steal, delete, or modify data. Other than that, SQL injection vulnerabilities can also enable the attacker to bypass authentication logic and thereby gain access to sensitive data and functionalities. There are three types of SQL injection vulnerabilities: in-band, blind, and lastly, out-of-band. In this video, we're going to discuss the in-band SQL injection, which is, compared to the other types of SQL injection, the easiest one to detect and exploit. In-band SQL injection basically means that the attacker is able to use the same communication channel to both launch the attack and to gather the resulting data. Just to give you an example, if the attacker exploits an SQL injection vulnerability on a website page, then the result of the attack, in other words the data retrieved from the database, will also be printed on the same page. In-band attacks can be broken down into two variations, more specifically error-based and union-based. So if we start with error-based SQL injection, in this case the attacker inserts malicious queries to provoke error messages that contain sensitive information about the database. Now this approach is very useful for enumerating databases. In order to trigger an error message, the attacker can for instance write an SQL command in an input field. The command can for instance be a single quote or any other SQL operator like or, and, not, and so on. By doing so, the application will return an SQL error containing information that is useful for further attacks. Moving on to union-based attacks, as you perhaps already know, the union operator in SQL is used to combine the result of two or more select statements into a single result set. If the application is vulnerable to in-band SQL injection, then the union operator can be used to retrieve additional data from other tables within the database. In other words, the attacker can get data beyond what the original SQL query was designed to fetch. Now, to give you an example, let's assume that the original query retrieves column A from table 1. If the union operator is employed, then the attacker can append an additional select query to get data from tables other than table 1. The attacker can, for instance, append union select column B from new table. By doing so, the attacker can gather data beyond what was expected from the original query. In other words, the attacker is now able to not only get data from table 1, he's also getting data from a table called new table. Alright guys, so now we know more about the theory, so let's move on and do some hacking. So here we have a very simple page where the user can search for user ID, and based on that, the first name and the last name are retrieved and displayed. So if we take a look under the hood, we can see that in this case the following SQL query was executed. This means that we are retrieving the first and the last name from a table called users. Good? So now we're all set to begin the attack. According to the instructions, we have 5 users in the DVWA, and our objective is to steal their passwords. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is to try to find out if this page is vulnerable to SQL injection in the first place. Now the simplest way of doing that is by performing an error-based SQL injection attack, in which we try to force the database to throw an error. If we get an error back, such as an SQL syntax error, then we know it is vulnerable. So one way of doing this attack is by trying to break the SQL query by inserting a single quote. After doing that, we will see that the application returns an SQL syntax error, and the cause for this error is that the interpreter is expecting 2 single quotes. But as we can see here, we have in total 3 single quotes in our query. So to summarize, this error indicates that we have found an SQL injection vulnerability that we can exploit. Alright, so the next step is to try to enumerate the database, which is just a fancy word for gathering information about our target. Now the first thing we can do is to try to figure out the number of columns that we have in the table. There are of course several ways of doing that. We can for instance use the union operator, which basically lets us execute 1 or more additional select queries and then append the result to the original query. So by doing that, we are basically going beyond what the original SQL query was intended to do. Alright, so let's input the following. So the idea behind this union select payload is to figure out the number of columns that are being returned from the original query. And this payload is suitable for this purpose because we are leveraging the fact that in union queries, the individual queries must return the same number of columns. This means that the number of columns returned by the original query must be equal to the number of columns returned by the injected query. If that is not the case, then an error will be produced. So the first time we do this, we can see that we get an error message informing us that our select statement has a different number of columns than the original select query. And by original, I mean the untampered query, of course. So let's continue to add columns and see what happens. Good. So now the error message is gone and we are getting some data back. That basically indicates that the original query returns 2 columns. But if you don't believe me, let's try to add a 3rd column and see what happens. As we can see here, as we added the 3rd column, an error message is being thrown again. We're not quite done yet with the enumeration, so let's continue to gather some more information. Now let's proceed to find out the name of the database. In order to do that, we can replace number 2 with the SQL function named database. This function will basically return the name of the database that we are targeting. Alright, now we can see that it worked. We can see the name of the database, which is DVWA in this particular case. So next we would like to have even more information by listing names of all the tables that exists in the database. To do that, we can use the following query. So let's break it down. The query says that we want to fetch table name from information schema. And information schema is very interesting for us since it contains details about all the databases and tables that the user has access to. So let's click on submit. Now we can see that we have 2 tables in the database. More specifically, guestbook and users. And as you remember, our goal is to steal the user's passwords. So obviously, the users table is very interesting. So let's keep probing to find out what columns exist in the user table by typing in the following query. Similar to the previous query, we're getting information from the information schema. Alright, now we can see all the columns in the users table, and luckily for us, we have a column named password. So let's go ahead and fetch the username and password with the following query. Great! Mission accomplished. And as we can see here, we have managed to display all the passwords. Alright guys, so that is going to be it for this video. I hope you have learned something valuable today. If you want to support this channel, you can like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. And if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section. So thanks for watching guys, and see you in the next one.